Chapter 1. History of the Zeta Reticuli. It is their wish to share their knowledge of what occurred in their past, so that others will not need to recreate it. Germain. For a clearer understanding of the Zeta Reticuli, one may study the history of their species. This will answer many questions about the Zeta psyche and belief systems. The Zeta Reticuli identity was created from crisis. This idea may account for their baffling methods of communicating with humans. Presented in this chapter is a brief history of the Zeta Reticuli, channeled from Germain. Audience questions highlight some of the fascinating historical data that is available as we search deeper into some of the aspects of the visitor phenomenon. Germain. The primary goal of sharing the history of the Zeta Reticuli with you is so it can allow you to see some parallels between their civilization in the past and yours in the present. There is quite a bit of similarity. Though the evolution of their race does not really occur linearly, we will place this story in a linear format. We begin back hundreds of thousands of years ago in the Lyran system. The roots of the humanoid race in your area of the galaxy emerged from the Lyran system. The Zeta Reticuli are no exception. Let us begin in the Lyran system back when civilization was flourishing and new cultures were exploding throughout the cosmos. The range of cultures these early humanoids created was vast. There was one planet we have called the Apex Planet, that we will refer to as the ancient origin of the Zeta Reticuli race. This Apex Planet was very similar to Earth. The beings on Apex were a mixture genetically just like you are, because the early Lyran races had already begun to colonize. Apex became a melting pot for the genetics of the Lyran races. Therefore, their society manifested a great deal of individuality and unpredictability. These qualities were even more pronounced than upon present-day Earth. There were those who were pacifists. There were those who were warriors. There were those who were technologically oriented, and those who rejected technology in favor of an inner spirituality. Every polarity one could imagine was played out on this apex planet even more dramatically than it is played out on your Earth plane. Their culture flourished for many thousands of years. However, beneath the surface of the mass consciousness there was a great deal of disharmony, because the spiritual growth of the planet did not parallel the technological growth of its inhabitants. The gap began to widen. On the surface of the planet, cataclysm began severe toxicity and severe radiation from atomic blasts, even more destructive than on your planet today. There was much pollution. The atmosphere began to deteriorate, and plant life was shortly thereafter unable to produce enough oxygen to continue the cycle of carbon dioxide-oxygen, which kept the ecosystem balanced. There were those within the system who were aware of what was happening. They began taking measures to preserve life. They built underground shelters and prepared themselves for the total destruction of the planet's surface. They didn't know whether this was going to occur, but they wanted to be safe. They knew they had a safety margin and that if they were prepared, their race would survive. They began learning to use alternate energy sources that could be used underground without any dependency on sunlight or oxygen from the surface. Thus, they created a world that would be totally independent from the surface ecosystem. Preparation stretched out over many generations. They were far-sighted, for they were certain this change needed to occur. They paced themselves and moved slowly. They began to see that they were evolving at such a rapid rate that the apexian cranial size was quickly increasing. The natural birth process became difficult, for the cranial size was expanding more quickly than the female pelvis could accommodate. Thus, there were many deaths during childbirth of both the mother and the child. Since what you call caesarean delivery was not part of their belief system, they were certainly facing a species crisis. They were faced with a dilemma. Their population was decreasing. It became obvious that they had to prepare for planetary catastrophe, as well as the possible death of their own species. They thus began turning to cloning techniques so they would not be dependent on the birth process. Then they could actually reproduce their species in the laboratory without the need for the reproductive act, conception, or natural birth. They assumed this knowledge would take care of them and they would be ready for anything. The Apexians did attempt to reverse some of the conditions that were occurring on the planet's surface before they took shelter underground. However, It had progressed too far. Many Apexians were dying from various diseases resulting from radiation or air pollution. They knew this was the time to move beneath the planet's surface. Gradually, individuals wrapped up their business on the surface of the planet and began to inhabit the underground cities. This was a great shock to many. Imagine knowing that you could never look at the sky again, that you could never lie under the stars, that you would be trapped in a rock environment for the rest of your life. Imagine the fear and sorrow these people were experiencing. Eventually, they all were moved underground. They had to learn how to adapt. Through their cloning capabilities, which they had been working on for at least 100 of their years, they began to understand how a body could adapt to an environment such as this. They began altering their genetics so that when new babies arrived, they could be part of the underground ecosystem. This entailed restructuring bodies so they could absorb frequencies of light beyond the visible spectrum and then change these frequencies into heat. This required a completely different way of body functioning and a new way of teaching the body to absorb nutrients. The bodies began learning to ingest nutrients from some of the luminiferous rocks underground. They had brought from the surface luminiferous plants as well. They studied these plants, which were chlorophyll-based, and allowed themselves to incorporate these qualities into themselves. All of this occurred over a span of hundreds of years. Many Apexians died. There were successes as well as failures. They eventually got to a point where the population growth leveled out as the death rate decreased. The methods by which they were taking in nutrients and recycling into the ecosystem became symbiotic and balanced. They knew they could survive this way for an indefinite period of time. While this was occurring under the surface of the planet, profound changes were occurring on the surface. The Apexians did not realize that the planet's toxicity had set a chain reaction in motion. Severe radiation had begun breaking down the planetary energy field on a subatomic level. This created an electromagnetic warp in the time-space fabric surrounding the apex planet. While they were underground, Apex actually shifted its position in the time-space continuum because of this dramatic subatomic energy breakdown. Time and space is very much like Swiss cheese. A planet in one location is connected through a series of multidimensional networks or passageways to other areas of your galaxy. When this warp began around their planet, the planet was moved through the fabric of time-space to another time-space continuum, which was a significant distance from their point of origin. You have labelled this area the Reticulum star group. The apex planet was inserted in the Reticulum system around one of the faintest stars in that star group. This occurred simply because the planetary shift followed the fabric of time and space. The underground Apexians were totally unaware of this as they continued with their lives under the surface. They continued saving their species. If something such as this occurred on Earth, there would be various factions of people living underground who would have no communication with each other. These factions could develop very different cultures over hundreds of years. This is what occurred on Apex. These different factions represent the different variations that have been viewed in the Zeta Reticuli groups. Some individuals say they are very negative, others say they are very benevolent. But it really isn't as black and white as that. Over the hundreds of years that they were underground, they deliberately manipulated their body type to suit their underground environment. They allowed themselves to become shorter in stature than they originally were, so they could make better use of the cavern space. It was merely a conservation effort. Because they were not procreating physically, their reproductive organs atrophied. Their digestive tracts atrophied because they were no longer taking in solid nutrients. They had mutated to allow themselves to take in nutrients through the skin. Their eyes adapted to the environment through the pupil mutating to cover the entire eye. This allowed them to absorb certain frequencies of light beyond the visible spectrum. They had to do this in order to make optimal use of their underground environment. This description of their changes is a general one, since different factions would have made slightly different alterations to their genetic structure. During this time, they evaluated what they had done to their planet. They concluded that emotions were largely responsible, so they no longer allowed emotion in their lives. They also vowed that they would no longer allow diversity in their culture. Thus, they deliberately bred out variations in emotional reactions to differing stimuli. They were adamant that their passions would no longer rule them. They began creating a neurochemical structure in which every external stimulus produced the same reaction in every person. They felt this would allow them to integrate into one people and eliminate the warring and passion that had ruled their culture in the past. Generally speaking, the separate underground factions followed the same reasoning. Most of them adapted themselves biologically in much the same way. This was a natural progression. They were following an equation. But the differences in the factions were more noticeable in their philosophic orientations. Each faction had differing points of view about their own sense of self. The ones you now call Zeta Reticuli are the more benign and benevolent beings. There are those we can term the negative Zeta Reticuli, who stemmed from a faction that was interested in gaining power. They carried this desire from their Lyran roots into their mutation. There were other groups whom you have named the Greys, who were from this apex world, but had slightly different genetic structures. You will find that the extraterrestrials playing a big role in your abduction literature come mostly from this original apex planet. This is why there is so much controversy over who is who. Though they have the same lineage, their orientations and motivations are quite varied. Eventually, the Apexians realized that enough time had passed that they could return to the surface of the planet. The atmosphere had not totally regenerated, thus their time on the planet's surface was limited, but they did allow themselves to emerge. When they did, they had quite a shock. Observing the star field, they knew the planet had shifted its position in the cosmos. The stars were very different. The astronomers who had been plotting the heavens during the seclusion were astonished. They realized then what they had done. The more benevolent Zeta Reticuli now were firmly committed to becoming one people and finding out what they had lost during the time they were underground. Thus they diligently learned about the folding of time and space. They didn't even know where they were. They wanted to find out what had happened. They wanted to learn about themselves through other cultures. It was also their desire for no one else to ever do to themselves what they had done. At this time, that was their primary motivation. The other, more negative or self-serving groups also emerged on the surface of the planet and realized what they had done. The negative Zeta Reticuli group allowed themselves, with the technology they had in the past, to build ships and move to other planets in the reticulum system where they built their culture. Others of the self-serving orientation allowed themselves to explore the universe, setting up colonies in several systems, including Orion, Betelgeuse, and the Sirius trinary system. Have any of these beings on Apex been reincarnationally connected with Earth? Reincarnationally speaking, a good number of them are upon your planet now. Many of these Apexians who died out were somewhat opposed to the idea of manipulating the Apexian genetic structure. But at the same time, they were adamant about not creating pollution and toxicity, and knew the Apex planet had to change. So they have incarnated all through the galactic family, especially whenever they saw a planet coming to the brink of the same kind of destruction they had created in their past. It is their wish to share their knowledge of what occurred in their past, so that others will not need to recreate it. So the Zetas are not indigenous to the reticulum system. Correct. However, after Apex shifted into the reticulum system, the Zetas had many thousands of years of evolution. They have been there so long that Apex is only a dim memory to them. If the Apexians had spacecraft, why didn't they leave Apex when the catastrophe was occurring? They could have left had they desired. Understand the nature of their being. They were pioneers. They had the same motivations and passions as the individuals who colonized your America. Even when the pioneers were faced with Indian attacks, they did not want to leave. The Apexians saw this as a great challenge. They felt that by going underground and changing their species, they would heal their past. They felt they would not recreate it again. The majority of them felt that if they left and went somewhere else, they would continue to recreate the pattern. Some of them did leave and went to other planets in the Lyran system, but only a small number. For the most part, the individuals who were committed allowed themselves to stay, feeling that this was an opportunity for them to heal their society. You were saying that the pupil of the eye mutated to cover the whole eye. Does the pupil also grow larger through expanded consciousness? In their case, yes. The brain was growing larger, and therefore the eye structure as well as their desire for knowledge facilitated the enlargement of the pupil. But they also genetically manipulated it as well. Over a long period of time, it would have occurred naturally, because the surface area of the eye was not large enough to take in all of the light they needed. Also, the Lyran beings who were their forefathers had larger eyes than the Earth human. Did the apex planet move back to its original location once they began healing themselves? No. The planet still remains in the Reticulum star system. The underground caverns are still home to many of them, though for the most part, a good number of them spend time in space on their ships. Is it possible in our time that our world could create something like this? Yes, it is. In your current development and use of atomic power, it is not possible. But should you continue using your knowledge of atomics for more destructive means, without allowing yourself to evolve from atomics to something else, then you could create that scenario. Understand that there is a certain evolutionary scale, on average, that a civilization will follow. You are now at the stage of playing with the nuclear or atomic energies. There is a natural evolution from atomics that moves you away from the danger point. You are at the point now of almost deciding to move away from the danger scenario. You are still deciding whether or not you are going to take the natural evolutionary process away from atomics. Most of the Zeta Reticuli that we interact with today are quasi-physical, almost approaching non-physicality. How did they get to that state? Was it simply the great length of time they've been focused on developing themselves? The length of time has something to do with it, yes. But also, it was because of their technological advancement which allowed them to evolve themselves physically. They have allowed themselves to evolve to the point where they are on the brink of becoming non-physical. However, they do not wish to leave physicality because there is still something they think they need to learn. Never forget that there are different factions of the Zeta beings. Some of them are very altruistic. There are others who are here purely for their own reasons, and those reasons can be either positive or negative or any shade in between. As an overall idea, they want certain things from you they feel they lack. You see, they think they have made some mistakes in what they have eliminated through cloning. They are now trying to watch you and learn how they can successfully integrate these things within themselves. In a sense, we can say that you are their past as well as their future. It is as if at every corner they turn, they face you. You represent their past. You also represent their only hope for a future.